In 1951, General Douglas MacArthur challenged United Nations rules of engagement in Korea. He believed they put American interests and American fighting men in unnecessary danger. The historical record proves that MacArthur was right, but the dangers have increased with virtually no further opposition until now. 44 years later, another soldier is decisively questioning orders from Commander-in-Chief Clinton. This time, the president's opponent is not a famous general, but a young E4 whose popular support is beginning to rival that of some movie stars and political candidates. T-shirts and radio ballads celebrate the courage of the Army medic who stood alone to question the legality of an order to surrender his U.S. military status to serve under UN command. Michael New was seeking neither celebrity status nor a confrontation with the president, but in simply attempting to honor his oath of duty, he has stumbled onto both. And the administration's approach to the exploding Michael New controversy is the same as it was in Douglas MacArthur's day. Answer none of the questions and get rid of the question. In early 1996, Michael New was forced out of the Army on a bad conduct discharge. The judge at the court-martial refused to hear evidence that proved Michael New was acting honorably, legally, and with a moral responsibility that must be exercised by every soldier. And so a model soldier was slapped with a ruthlessly unjust conviction that appears to be a warning to any who question the authority or the actions of the United Nations. Michael New will appeal his conviction in order to clear his name. In so doing, his case will force into public record startling information that has been hidden from the American people for almost half a century. Michael New grew up as an average, quiet, unassuming American boy. Missionary travels with a large family exposed him to foreign cultures that taught him appreciation for American culture. From his homeschooling curriculum, he apparently learned details of American history and government that seemed to have vanished from stateside classrooms. New joined the U.S. Army in 1993, 3 days before Bill Clinton began to change military policy and strategy. New stood out in several ways, but it was especially evident that he had a well-developed allegiance to uniquely American ideals. To New's superiors, both on and off the field, it was clear that Michael New held somewhat outdated views of duty, honor, and country, but these views made him a model soldier, and he was decorated for exemplary service. New's legal ordeal began shortly after Independence Day, 1995, when he learned that his unit might be ordered to the Balkans, compelled to go as mercenaries, as UN personnel, in UN uniforms, under foreign command. New expressed his concerns about the legality of such orders and was at first ridiculed, then threatened to conform or face court-martial. When New appeared unfazed by the threat of court-martial, he was curtly advised to review U.S. constitutional law and the UN Charter. On September 21, 1995, New respectfully submitted his findings and position to his superiors in writing, asking them in turn for written explanations so he could review the unusual order and strive to obey it. The only justification provided by the Army was a verbal briefing by an Army lawyer designed to address concerns of New's fellow soldiers. Immediately after the briefing, the commander gave the fateful order to Michael New and 550 others. The battalion formation 8 days later would be in UN uniform.
Our battalion was called in for an information briefing. This is a briefing on the legal basis for deployment and wear of the United Nations insignia. I understand ours was the only unit to have this before we deployed over there. That was probably due in part to me. But And during this briefing, he just gave a broad overview of what the Army thought was the legal justification, including things like the president says so, therefore it is. And when it came up to the question of why do we wear United Nations insignia, his rather flippant answer was simply because they look fabulous. And I didn't think that was very funny.
Because they look fabulous. A mocking and rather cruel answer to a young man facing court-martial, jail, a bad conduct discharge, and a life-offering circumstance.
With no written response from the Army, New began discussing the position with Kentucky Attorney Ron Ray, a former Marine colonel and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense.
I fully intend to obey all lawful orders. Right? Understandable, okay? The second point being that I interpret the wearing of the uniform or the accoutrements of the uniform as a sign of allegiance and faithfulness to the authority or power that it represents. Right. Okay. Third point was that I'm not trying to avoid a difficult or dangerous assignment and get out of the Army. I served in Kuwait.
Ray assured New that his position carried the weight of law and that the Army's position seemed to rest not on the law, but was driven by raw political power, constitutional manipulation, and sheer intimidation. On October 10, Michael New faced a tremendous amount of intimidation. The UN had delivered the controversial blue uniforms to every soldier in Michael's unit, and all fell into formation as ordered by Commander-in-Chief Clinton. All except one. Army Specialist New reported for duty at 0900 in the battle dress uniform of the United States Army.
I showed up about 10 minutes before the formation was to actually take place, and I was the only one wearing a green uniform, and everybody looked at me funny, and my squad leader asked me if I knew what the prescribed uniform was for that formation, and I told him yes, and he said, well, I'm going to give you another chance to put it on, and I told him, sorry, I'm not going to do this on, and he said, okay, and before he called everybody to attention, my squad leader called me out of ranks and took me back inside the building, and he took me to the captain, who read me my rights. From there, I was turned over back to my original captain, and he also read me my rights. And from there, I kind of went up the chain of command to the colonel.
Farther up the chain of command, there was no small amount of confusion about what to do with Specialist New. He volunteered to be transferred quietly to another unit, but it was the Army's decision to make an example of New and to pursue a disciplinary bad conduct discharge. To keep the proceedings a matter of public record, New asked for public proceedings, knowing full well that he could go to prison and be forever forbidden from completing a promising military career.
I would rather have a clear conscience and be in trouble or be being punished for it than to escape scot-free and feel guilty.
Michael's parents were surprised by how quickly Michael came to a decision without any hesitation.
I pretty much knew what I was going to do, but there wasn't a whole lot to decide, and I just felt it was really wrong, therefore I couldn't do it. And, you know, it wasn't really much of a big deal to me, but my parents were really upset over the whole thing. I guess Mom was looking out for her baby, and I think she's taking it harder than anybody.
This has been a hard time for our family to go through, because parents don't like to see their children suffer. We suffer when they suffer. However, we're very proud of Michael for standing up for principles that we taught him. We're proud of him for having firm moral convictions based on truth, based on what is right. We're proud of him for being willing to stand up against a lot of opposition. It's not easy. When your case is named the United States government versus Specialist Michael New, that's rather daunting. I really hope and pray that Michael's stand will in some way awaken the American people to recognize that our nation seems to be in peril.
Critics of deliberate UN policies are puzzled by how consistently they endanger U.S. servicemen and effectively work against the wishes of U.S. combat officers and even the dictates of common sense.
I understand that as a UN peacekeeper, Michael would have been not under the Geneva Convention, but and therefore would not be treated as a prisoner of war, but would be treated as a hostage. And this really frightens me because of what happened to Colonel Higgins in Lebanon.
When Rangers in Somalia requested the weapons needed to protect themselves, they were denied by the UN, and the results were savagely gruesome.
Vice President Al Gore said last year when some of the men who died in Somalia at their funeral, the parents of the soldiers who died could be very proud of their sons because they died in the service of the UN. My husband and I would not be at all happy to hear that our son, that we should be comforted because our son died in the service of the UN.
A fellow asked me how did I feel about the fact that Michael is being turned into a cause célèbre for isolationism. And the question really surprised me. I had never thought of our position as being an isolationist position. And my reaction at the time was that and certainly now having thought about it a bit, is that we really don't feel like we're isolationists, but we believe in the sovereignty of our country. We believe that America is and ought to be a free country. And it seems very logical to me that if you can force the army of one country to serve under the authority of another country, then that first power, that first army is not a free country. It's not a free army. It's a very simple thing to me, and we've taught this to our children, looking at Rome, where the Roman government could force other countries to provide legions and to provide soldiers for them, that they were satellite nations. And one of the implications in the uniform change they've made is that they've moved the United Nations patch from the left in mid-93 to the right shoulder. Now that's the dominant patch. That's the patch that indicates the commanding force. And the unit patch is on the left. Well, the United States flag has been moved over to the left shoulder. And what that tells those who follow uniforms, it makes a very bold and blatant statement, is that the United States of America has become a unit in the New World Army, in the United Nations Army. And that's a tremendously scary proposition when you stop and think about the implications of that uniform change.
A lot of good men have bled in the same uniform for my country, and I'm not willing to take it off now to fight for some foreign government that doesn't have our ideals at heart. I think that's disrespectful to all the veterans and all the people who died fighting for America.
New's objection to his orders went far deeper than sentiment for the uniform or fear of prosecution for violating military regulations.
Your questions were solid questions, and somebody should have answered your questions with specificity.
Something in his upbringing suggested that it is wrong to surrender sovereignty at any time, but especially hazardous to surrender to a foreign power called dangerous by U.S. leaders on both left and right.
Michael's superiors, seniors, who asked him to research the United Nations Charter, its history, and objectives, have given us an excellent opportunity to do in-depth research, to talk to people who've looked at this over 50 or 60 years since the United Nations was given birth. Remember first that Alger Hiss, an assistant secretary in the State Department, a very close advisor to President Roosevelt, in fact stood at his shoulder at Yalta when Eastern Europe was essentially ceded to the authority of the Soviet Union and Stalin, was the first acting Secretary General at the original organizational session of the United Nations in 1945 in San Francisco. And there have been many other security risks like Alger Hiss who have been Americans involved with the United Nations. Let's look at it today as we consider whether our sons and daughters should go to Bosnia. Who is the leading United Nations civilian undersecretary in the Balkans? An Iraqi diplomat, that is, an appointee of Saddam Hussein, named Ismat Khatani. And Khatani had, until recently, been in the inner circle of the Secretary General Boutros Ghali in New York. And he has been given temporary command over all United Nations operations in the Balkans, which I believe, and it's not been clarified, would include the able sentry deployment or prevent deployment that Michael New's former battalion, the 1st of the 15th Infantry Brigade, was making into Macedonia. So you have to ask yourself the question, we're putting on a foreign government's uniform, a foreign government that has in the past been frequently hostile to American interests. If George Bush was correct, that Saddam Hussein represented the same threat to the international security and peace and to the United States that Adolf Hitler did, and was as much of a monster as Adolf Hitler was, Saddam Hussein's diplomat is the senior United Nations official, at least in an acting capacity, in the Balkans.
UN military influence has been growing steadily since 1945, a growth that has been accomplished by one simple factor. The representatives of sovereign nations and their military personnel have willingly surrendered military decisions, military hardware, and military personnel to the UN and its dangerous rules of engagement. House Speaker Newt Gingrich has noted that the United Nations military force model is a total disaster. Gingrich went on to say that no military forces should be used in a constabulary role. It demoralizes and undermines the military, Gingrich observed. You cannot ask soldiers to train to be hostages. You cannot ask soldiers to drive around in white vehicles. You cannot ask soldiers to wear blue helmets because in that process they cease to be soldiers. The purpose of a military force is to impose your will by violence if necessary, and by guile and stealth if possible. The purpose of the military is not to sit around and be a political tool to be manipulated by diplomats in totally unmilitary matters. Growing numbers of U.S. congressmen are frustrated that President Clinton is not responding to their demands to disclose information about his unmilitary intentions for Michael New and the armed forces. According to UN documents, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and U.S. law, the deployment to Macedonia required congressional approval. To avoid obtaining congressional approval, the White House either deliberately or accidentally misled Congress about the technical nature of the deployment. Colonel Ron Ray suggests that this illegal deployment to Macedonia may be an impeachable offense, which was preceded by a deliberate effort to deceive Congress. More than 40 U.S. congressmen have asked President Clinton to square his orders with the Constitution and military regulations. He is apparently as incapable of this as were Michael New's immediate superiors, who told the young soldier to figure it out for himself.
When this whole thing started, when I first expressed my reservations about wearing this United Nations insignia and accoutrements, when I expressed my reservations, they said, I think you need to do a little more study on the United Nations, their history and objectives, and see what they actually are, because we don't think they're a foreign power or a foreign government like you say they are. So I did some study, and my study tends to indicate that they are a foreign power and a foreign government. Although they don't have a landmass per se, they still have all the elements that a government needs to have. They have a ruler and a governing body, the Secretary General, General Assembly, Security Council. They have a treasury and a banking system. They have courts and a legal system. They have an array of bureaucratic agencies. They have a flag, an oath of allegiance, a charter. They don't have a tax yet, but that is in the workings. They're proposing a global tax. And the last thing that they're missing is a military force. And that's what they're trying to make me.
News independent research also revealed other disturbing goals of the United Nations, described in its charter in chapters 5 and 7, which speak in hopeful terms about the day when the military force of the international order will be so strong that no single nation can challenge or resist its will, or its peace enforcers. The oath of the UN requires that UN bureaucratic officials swear allegiance to a one-world government and must reject the sovereign claims and all the interests of their own nation and obey no laws except those of the United Nations. Michael New swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and to obey the orders of his American superiors according to the regulations and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It is this phrase in the oath that reminds all officers and politicians that they can order only what is permitted by law. This phrase keeps America a government of laws, not of men. Why is it that all Army communication excludes this phrase when discussing the oath taken by Michael New? Are the armed forces planning to recruit and keep only men and women who blindly obey every order?
They used to teach the Constitution in the Army back during all the way up to the 30s, I think. And nowadays they don't teach you that in basic training or AIT. If they do, it's very brief. You don't do any in-depth studies. We just basically cover the laws of land warfare and that type of thing. But I think soldiers should be better educated about their own government.
If you read the 1990 edition of the Army's Military Leadership Manual, it's clear that the Army at least used to teach and adhere to the same kind of things that Daniel and Suzanne New adhered to in the upbringing of their son. Article 92, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, says that soldiers are under a duty to obey lawful orders of the seniors appointed over them. The heart of this issue will be whether or not the order given was a legal order. Article 92 also says that patently illegal orders are not to be obeyed. Now obviously this is measured under time and circumstances, and in the heat of combat you certainly don't want to have soldiers questioning the orders of the seniors appointed over them. But the principle that comes down through military law that was really codified in the Nuremberg trials is that soldiers have a duty to disobey illegal orders. In other words, it is no defense later on if you're prosecuted for a war crime or other crime. You may not defend yourself successfully by saying, I was ordered by senior officers to do what I did.
What we have here is a young man who has stood on principle, not for personal gain, against a nebulous and amorphous policy which the Army is incapable of explaining 3 or 4 months after it has been challenged. The specialist New is a young man who is refreshing in as much as he stands on principle. He believes something and he's willing to take a stand for it. And I must stress that this is not a soldier who's trying to avoid sleeping in the rain and rolling in the mud and being tired and hungry doesn't want to deploy. To the contrary, he wants to deploy, but he wants to do it as an American, not as a United Nations minion for Boutros Ghali.
Here they come.
Mr. Gray will make a statement. There you go.
Good. The order that was given to Specialist New during early October 1995 is an illegal order. And historically, there's never been a court-martial of an American soldier who expressed his reluctance to wear the uniform of a foreign government. And,
New's attorneys had few resources, but in the days preceding the trial, they accumulated a mountain of historic, legal, Army, constitutional, congressional, and United Nations evidence that proved Michael New had been right in his hesitancy to obey an order that was dangerously illegal. When the Army admitted that the UN uniform was unauthorized by Congress, it was clear that New had not disobeyed a lawful order. What then shocked many observers was the judge's sudden and unprecedented ruling that none of the evidence of the illegality of the order could be presented at the trial. Furthermore, the judge instructed the military jury that they could not entertain the idea that the order was illegal. Thus, Michael New was disgraced with a conviction of bad conduct. According to the Washington Times, the conviction is a stain that will stick with him long after he leaves the Army, hurting his chances for employment and locking him out of veterans' benefits. Most importantly to New, it grossly misrepresents his record of uncommon good conduct.